Ladies, you have just finished lesson 2 of Reclaiming Friendship. In some ways, I think this is the most crucial lesson of the entire study because we are laying a foundation. And if we get the foundation right, there is a good chance that we will get a lot of other things right as well. See, when we go back to the beginning, when we go back to Genesis, we can actually see God's purpose for us. We can see His purpose and plan for our relationships. He meant all of it for good. But the problem is that most of us operate outside of that plan and purpose. And so while we want to serve God and others, we find that we spend much of our time in relationships dealing with hurt feelings and dysfunction. Why is that? While some of the problem is that we are simply outright sinners, something that we'll talk about in the next lesson, another, less complicated problem is that our love for God often competes with our predominant worldview. What do I mean by that? What many of us don't realize is that while we've had experiences with God, the church, and Catholicism, we are products of the culture in which we have been raised. So while we may have a love for God and a desire to live in His will, we don't see our world as He sees it. When we aren't operating according to how God sees the world, we will inevitably behave in a way that is outside of His will. And this leads us to problems. See, the way that you see the world is your worldview. It's your particular philosophy of life or conception of the world. And it provides a foundation for how you make sense of everything. Your worldview dictates how you see and interact with yourself and others and the world around you. See, worldview is super important to how you perceive the world and behave. And so you would think that most of us would be intentional about how we form our worldview by seeking out the answers to life's deepest questions and always seeking the truth. But most of us don't do this. While some people decide how they will see the world by studying different philosophies and then choosing to live by the one that makes sense to them, most of us simply consume popular culture, which in turn forms our worldview. As a result, our love for God competes with our secular worldview, and as Jesus said, we cannot serve two masters. We find ourselves longing for God's righteousness while playing the game of life according to the rules of the world. Author Frank Sheed said it this way in his book, Theology and Sanity. Now, most of us have Catholic wills, but not many of us have Catholic intellects. When we look at the universe, we see pretty well what other people see, plus certain extra features taught to us by our religion. For the most part, the same influences that form other people's minds form ours. The same thoughts of habit, the same inclinations, bodily senses, and indolences. We are worked upon by the same newspapers, periodicals, bestsellers, films, and radio programs. So we have not so much Catholic minds as worldly minds with Catholic patches. Intellectually, we wear our Catholicism like a badge on the lapel of the same kind of suit that everyone else is wearing. The result is that God exists in our hearts, but does not infiltrate our daily reality, which causes a breakdown between our affection for God and our daily behavior. Can you think of this playing out in your own life? Here is an example from mine. Now, when I was in college, I was driving home from class listening to a popular praise and worship album. Once I finished it, I popped in a Lil Wayne album and started rapping along. In seconds, I went from praising Jesus to trying to sing some of the most degrading lyrics that have been recorded to that time. Now, I had done this many times before without even a thought to what I was doing, but this time was different. The hypocrisy was so evident. Being that I was preparing to go on a mission trip in a few months, I paused the album, thought for a minute, and then threw it out. How is it that in the middle of a major conversion, I could enjoy music that was so contrary to the life I was trying to live? It's because I was living in two competing worldviews. On one hand, I was falling in love with God, and on the other hand, I was going through my daily life steeped in the modern world and its values. And those values have nothing to do with the things that matter to God. And it wasn't until I began to allow God to reset my worldview with Him and His purpose at the center that my vision, choices, and behaviors began to change and match more with His will for my life and relationships. This is exactly what we just did in Lesson 2. We went back to the beginning to find God's purpose for our friendships. Knowing and understanding God's purpose for our friendships, we can allow Him to reset any lies we have absorbed from the culture about friendship, and we can start to believe and live in His truth. God's plan for connection is different from the culture's understanding. American and Western European cultures are very individualistic, and so we understand relationships and friendships through that lens. The way we view friendship has been formed by a culture that exalts self and personal autonomy over everything else. Here are a few examples of how it plays out. A few common characteristics of individualistic cultures include being dependent upon others is often considered shameful or embarrassing. Independence is highly valued. Individual rights take center stage. People often place a greater emphasis on standing out and being unique. People tend to be self-reliant. And the rights of the individual tend to take higher precedence. Now, while these aren't necessarily bad things, the emphasis that we place on them in society can be detrimental to our relationships. If we engage with others with the foundation of self above all, our friendships will fail because we cut off the flow of love between friends right where it begins to grow, in our need for each other. When we are consumed with self-preservation, we fail to be honest in relationships. When we exalt self-reliance or consider dependencies shameful or embarrassing, we steal from others their ability to love us by rejecting acts of kindness and generosity. When we are only worried about our own individuality, we fail to seek out and meet the needs of those around us. And when we are only worried about ourselves, humanity cannot be shared. And shared humanity is a necessary building block for thriving relationships. If we take a different look, however, and open the scriptures, we will find that the gospel offers us a completely different understanding of relationships and how we should act with others. See, in Matthew 12:18-31, Jesus tells the disciples that the two most important commandments are to love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is that you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Romans 15:2 says, "Let each of us please his neighbor for his good to edify him." Philippians 2:3 says, "Do nothing from selfishness or conceit, but in humility count others better than yourselves." Romans 12:10 says, "Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor." And Galatians 6:2 says, "Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." Ephesians 5:21 says, "Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ." When we follow these things, at the very least, we will have peace because we are incorporating God's unchanging truth into the way that we treat others. Our behavior will begin to work with His will instead of against it. But at the very best, we will see Christ come alive in our relationships and dysfunction start to go away. Does this mean that everything will be perfect? No. But God works in our obedience, and we will be surprised at just how deep His joy and healing can go. In Matthew chapter 19, Jesus is preaching and the crowd asks Him about the law of Moses. And Jesus told the crowd, He said, "Moses allowed you to do these things because of the hardness of your heart. But in the beginning, it was not so." Jesus was constantly bringing us back to the beginning to reset our worldview and to conform our minds to God, whose truth reigns whether we live according to it or not. You are now equipped with this foundation. God made you to share in His own blessed life. He made you to enjoy relationships with others. Those relationships bring us joy, teach us to love, and reflect the eternity that waits for us with Him. Equipped with this reset, let Him soften your heart to anything that might get in the way of your love, and let's continue to let Him reclaim our friendships. See you after Lesson 3.